Welcome to our training on Category 3 inspection as part of the Pennsylvania Safety Inspection Training Program. Now, this training is meant to address the unique differences for our Category 3 vehicles. It's intended for someone who already has their inspection license, is familiar with the baseline requirements, and perhaps has a Cat 1 or Cat 2 inspection license already, and is looking to add a Cat 3 inspection license to inspect trucks. So if that's you, this training should be helpful. So first of all, we want to look at what our Cat 3 or Cat 3 inspection license allows the inspector to inspect. That is for trucks over 17,000 pounds GVW, also known as heavy trucks. Any trailer 10,000 pounds or over also requires a Cat 3 inspection license, as well as our buses. Now, if you already have other categories, know that your inspection license might have a combination. So as well as Class 3, but also Class 4, 6, and 7 can all inspect these Category 3 vehicles. Now, a question that comes up often is, do I need a CDL to inspect a heavy truck? And that depends. If you notice that Cat 3 license starts at 17,000 GVW, a CDL is not needed until you're driving a vehicle over 26,000 pounds. So there is a range there between 17,001 to 26,000 GVW where you would need a Cat 3 inspection license to inspect those vehicles, but you would not need a CDL. You would only need a Class C driver's license to drive them. That could be your kind of what we consider medium duty trucks. Ford F450s, F550s often fall in that category. Now, if you are inspecting a truck over 26,000 GVW, then yes, you do need a CDL. You would need a Class A a Class B. If it's a combination, a large trailer, you would need Class A driver's license depending on the vehicle. There are some bulletins that address this. There is a rare exception that if the entirety of the road test can be done on an off-road site, it might be possible for the inspection mechanic to only have a Class C license and still be able to do that. But understand, I mean, we're talking about getting these vehicles up to highway speed. So you would have to be able to get up to 55, 60 miles an hour, test stopping distance. So it's going to be a rare case that a private site would have that type of area to allow you to inspect without a CDL. In addition to having to have a CDL, there are also clarifications regarding endorsements. So notice what it says in the manual. It says that the inspection mechanic shall have a valid driver's license for each class of vehicle which the mechanic will inspect, except that a certified mechanic who inspects a school bus is not required to hold a school bus driver endorsement. So, for example, if you're inspecting a school bus, you will need to have a bus endorsement, a passenger bus, but you do not have to have a school bus because there will not be school students on it when you're inspecting it. But there are other examples where, an empty tanker trailer, if it's still placarded, you would need to have that hazmat endorsement as well as a tank endorsement. Bulletins 19-07, which was from 2019, and a more recent one, Bulletin 25-04, provide further clarification about this. There is also wording in there, this is covered in Bulletin 05-4, that trailers that are over 17,000 GVW do not have to have PA safety inspection performed if they're using DOT inspection. And in this picture, you can see a DOT inspection sticker. That is a federal sticker. Notice that this only applies to trailers. Heavy trucks, if they're registered in PA, still require PA safety inspection. They could have DOT on top of that, but it does not replace the need for PA safety inspection for a truck. This is only for trailers, and that is only for trailers over 17,000 gross vehicle weight rating. There's also another tricky thing in there with that. Our inspection allows vehicles to be inspected up to 3 months ahead of time, which for a passenger car, that allows it to be inspected as long as 15 months. The wording is a little bit the same for heavy trucks, but there is a federal regulation that supersedes it, and that's the motor carrier regulations, and they require that our motor carrier vehicles, aka heavy trucks, be inspected every 12 months. So even though our PA law would seem to allow doing it up to 3 months early and being able to give a 15-month sticker for any motor carrier vehicle, which would be heavy truck over 17,000 pounds, it can only be inspected for a maximum of a 12-month period. So whatever month you're inspecting it in, that is the same month it will expire a year later. The majority of the inspection requirements for our Cat 3 vehicles is found in Subchapter F. If you're studying for the test, that's where you're going to want to spend most of your time. That applies to medium and heavy trucks, buses, and school buses. Just like other subchapters, there are two sections to it. So it begins with equipment requirements from page 43 to 51. Those are the regulations that the vehicle must meet to drive on roadways in Pennsylvania. They're enforced by police, law enforcement officers, DOT officers. The inspection procedure, what the mechanic is going to be performing when it comes in for inspection, begins on page 51 and continues to the end of the subchapter. Those are the reject if criteria that the inspector's mechanic is going to start for or check for. It is noted too that you should be following that in order. That was in one of the most recent PA inspection bulletins, that you should start with verifying the ownership and the proof of financial responsibility or insurance, and you would end with the road test. So try to follow it in the order laid out in that chapter. We're only going to be hitting the highlights, some of the things that are different for our vehicles. So on page 44, this is in equipment requirements, and you can see that it has a requirement for the parking brake. It says the parking brake shall be adequate to hold the vehicle on a surface free from ice or snow on a 20% grade with the vehicle in neutral. So that's how we check our parking brake. We don't, apply it at any given speed. It's saying that if it's trucks on a 20% grade, which is relatively steep, in neutral, not in park, the brake should be sufficient to hold it. There's also wording on page 44 that in the current edition of the manual is still incorrect. So if you want to make this correction in the book, it currently reads, it says a tire may be equipped. It should actually say that it may not be equipped. That's how it's worded with passenger cars, all the other vehicles. They omitted the word not in the more recent editions. But even though we don't often see studded tires on our heavy trucks, they may not be equipped with studded tires that exceed, with projections exceeding 2/32 inch. So they can be sticking out in a 1/32 or up to 2/32. They cannot stick out beyond that. In the lighting and electrical requirements, it talks about the headlamp system. If it's a 4 headlamp system, 2 lamps shall be of the type 2 construction, 2 lamps shall be of the type 1 construction. And back in the appendix of the manual, it addresses what those different lights look like. It also says a vehicle like this can only have 1 pair of approved auxiliary driving lights and fog lamps. So you can't have 4 fog lamps across the bottom. You could only have 2 fog lamps and 2 auxiliary driving lamps in addition to the headlights. Mirrors. There is wording in there about rear window louvers. This matches passenger cars, but just want to go over this. For our heavy trucks, it would be rare to see, but in the picture here, you can see louvers on a pickup truck. That's what we're talking about. They're not too common anymore, but I don't want it to trip anyone up. If it's equipped with rear window louvers, the vehicle has to have 2 outside mirrors, one on the driver's side, one on the passenger side. There's wording about a wood plank bumper when it comes under the chassis. So wood plank bumpers would only be permitted on a road service truck or wrecker. And even then, they should be attached to either regular bumper or equivalent steel backing. They should not solely be wood. There is requirements for fenders and flaps. So in this picture, we can see fenders placed on a heavy truck. A vehicle in this subchapter needs to have wheels sufficiently covered with fenders or flaps to prevent loose objects, rain, snow, and the like from being thrown out on the highway or on other vehicles. And there is a requirement for it. If you look at the rear wheel shields on page 51, it says a vehicle specified in this subchapter, except the truck, tractor, while towing a trailer, because the trailer is essentially going to block that same thing. If it's bobtailing, it would need this though. Shall be constructed or equipped with, I'm going to say, mud flaps or wheel shields to bar water or other road surface substances thrown from the rear wheels of the vehicle or combination at tangents exceeding 22.5 degrees, measured from the road surface, from passing a straight line to the rear of the vehicle or combination. So this picture hopefully clarifies it for you. What they're talking about is a 22.5 degree angle coming off the back of that tire, and you kind of project a line from that. So the closer the mud flap is to the wheel, the further it has to come down to catch anything that would come off at 22.5 or greater angle. Some flatbed trucks might stick the body out far enough that it would catch that line and no mud flap is required. So you can see there, depending on my distance from the wheel, the mud flap has to come down and catch that. I have heard a tip that some mechanics have went to a hardware store or plumbing store and bought a 22-degree angle, maybe for PVC pipe, and stuck two, 3 or 4 foot lengths of pipe in either end and lay that next to the wheel. Now, a 22-degree bend is actually 22.5 degrees, same as this requirement. If they lay that flat on the ground, they can kind of use that pipe as the projected line and determine if the mud flap falls where it needs to be. There are also other charts where it says, if the mud flap is X amount behind the wheel, it needs to come within this distance of the ground. So you could either use a gauge like I described or reference those charts to check for this. Now we get to the inspection procedure on page 51. The majority of what you're checking is identical to passenger cars and light trucks. So we're going to try and hit on the highlights that, maybe it's the same wording, but it's checked differently, or it's something unique to our trucks, such as the items regarding air brakes. So we're not covering the entirety of the inspection procedure. We're assuming you already have that level of knowledge. This isn't meant to replace the inspection course. This is meant to only add to it what you need to know for heavy trucks found in Subchapter F. On the slide here, you can see a link for a checklist. I will include that link in the description below. First thing on there on page 52 is the tailgate. It says the tailgate basically needs to be on the vehicle. That would be rejected if it's not on the vehicle, unless it's removed for the addition of optional equipment that's present at the time of inspection. So in this picture, a salt spreader would be a perfect example of that. There's some equipment, maybe a lift gate, that's meant to essentially replace the normal tailgate. If that equipment is present and properly attached, then that does not need the tailgate at that time. Now, if they would remove the salt spreader from the body of this truck, they would need to reinstall the tailgate before it can be driven on the roads or pass PA safety inspection. For outside mirrors, it states to reject if it does not have a mirror with minimum reflective surface area. So notice that on all of our vehicles over 10,000 pounds, that is 50 square inches. So these vehicles need the larger mirrors. They need to meet that requirement. Not saying you need to measure this and calculate for every mirror. If it looks like the standard normal size that you're used to, it would be acceptable. But if it is smaller or looks questionable, yeah, you're going to have to get a tape measure out and do some math to figure out the surface area. Here we're seeing the rear wheel shields, the mud flaps again. We had already seen that in equipment requirements, but here's the reject if. It says if it's not equipped with rear wheel shields or mud flaps as required under PA code. I already explained that PA code basically is looking at a 22.5 degree angle, and anything that would come off at an angle greater than that needs to be caught by the body or the shields or mud flaps. Notice it goes on to say that there cannot be any lamps or wiring attached to any guard or flap. We're talking about not the bracket, but the part that swings. There can't be lights on the bottom or any wires zip tied to it. And the guard or flap has to be of suitable strength. So notice it says if it does not consist of suitable metal protectors or substantial flexible flaps, which are strong enough to prevent stones or objects from being thrown through them. Now, this doesn't mean the mud flap cannot be a mesh material. Some are a really tight mesh that allow water or wind through there, but will catch any rocks or objects being thrown through. But you can't have cardboard or a rag or a mud flap that has large holes in it that isn't going to catch objects. On buses, they have some special criteria applicable to their handrails. Now, I know you may not be planning on inspecting buses, but understand that your license will permit you to do this, so you need to be familiar with these requirements. It says it reject if the step well is cluttered or worn to present a tripping hazard. So where they get onto the bus, there can't be a box, a lost and found, the metal protectors, the rubber mat there can't be a tripping hazard, can't have holes in it or something that'll trip people up. Goes on to say the guardrails or grab rails can't be loose or have fastening parts missing, so there can't be any screws missing. They have to be secure. The service doors cannot bind, jam, or malfunction, preventing proper operation. They basically have to work smoothly, work freely. The emergency exit is not easily accessible. Again, they can't have a large box or lost and found or something stored in the way of the emergency exit. They can't have an additional seat added blocking it. And lastly, it says the inside or outside quick release mechanisms on the emergency doors or windows of the bus fail to function positively or opens accidentally or too easily. So basically, the emergency exits have to latch properly. They have to work easy enough. We're not talking about windows that you have to break out, of course, but we're talking about the ones that are latched and you would open them up, or the hatch in the roof. It needs to open properly. The bumpers, much the same requirements as a passenger vehicles, or at least of the light trucks. It's the same dimensions there, but the bumpers have to be on the vehicle if required as original equipment. Some part of the horizontal bumper bar on medium and heavy trucks does not fall within 16 to 30 inches above ground level. So we're talking about that in that range. Some part of the horizontal portion has to fall in that range. You can kind of see it shown in this picture here. Lamps and lenses, again, identical wording to what we saw in the passenger cars subchapter, but might be a little different application. So it says exterior bulb or sealed beam, if originally equipped or installed, fails to light properly except ornamental lights. If you remember, ornamental lights are not legal on roadways. They're lights that do not serve a legitimate purpose. They are wrong color. We see some trucks with what they call chicken lights, or they add a lot of lights to the vehicle. Now, in most cases, they are designed to be clearance lights. They are the right color, they're the right locations, which makes them legal. However, now that since they are marker or clearance lamps, they now have to work for inspection. So even if they have 100 lights down the side of that truck, if one of them is out, that now fails inspection unless it's an ornamental lamp. Now, in some vehicles, they have an exterior inspection light switch that can make your life easier. That will basically activate the lights, flash them in a certain sequence. So you can use that during your inspection to check that. It's meant for the driver to help them during a pre-trip, but it can be helpful to you as a technician as well. There is also some judgment regarding LED lamps. I really like this picture because it kind of shares a spectrum. In the technical part of the wording, we saw that says any lamp that doesn't light properly is rejectable. Now, an LED lamp manufacturer would have to say that technically all the LEDs in that lamp have to work, and understand that law enforcement could still hold to that. But that was presenting an unnecessary burden to vehicle owners. So PennDOT issued guidance in 2018 in this bulletin here, BI 18-01. And it said it basically allows you, the inspection mechanic, to make a judgment call on the LED lamps. Are they, working properly? Are they emitting enough light to be safe? Now, PennDOT did provide the guidance that said, hey, look, if half of the diodes are out, that light should fail. That is not working. And I totally agree with that. But, if you have one or two diodes out and most of the pattern's lit, kind of like what we see here on the left lamp, I would say that should pass. The middle lamp here has a little more diodes out, but it covers most of the pattern. I could see a technician making a call either way, passing that, or if you want to make a case to fail it, maybe it's not bright enough. It'd be hard to argue with that judgment. Now, the lamp on the right, the LED there, absolutely, I think should fail. We are not covering the whole pattern, the whole circle, and it's less than half the LEDs lit, so that one would fail. So in this one picture, you can see an example where one should definitely pass, one maybe a judgment call on your part, and the far right one definitely should fail. Page 54 of Subchapter F, it talks about checking shock absorbers. And again, this matches the wording we saw for light duty vehicles. But if you think about it, for a medium and heavy truck, it might be a bit unrealistic that you're going to walk up to the front or back of that truck and start it bouncing and count the number of cycles. Really, you'll do a visual inspection as part of underneath the vehicle, and maybe you'll notice a bouncing shock on a road test, but for a heavy vehicle, you're not always going to be able to get it bouncing as they would have described there. The fifth wheel assembly, there they have two criteria. It says the lower half of the fifth wheel is not securely affixed by U-bolts or by other secure means, and the lower half of the fifth wheel is cracked, loose, missing, or has inoperative locking devices. Now, keep in mind, the upper half of the fifth wheel is on the trailer, so the lower half of the fifth wheel is everything we have on the truck. That is what you'll be inspecting. To help you with that, we have this 3-minute video clip with a demonstration of what we will be checking.
First line item being the lower half of the fifth wheel is not securely affixed by U-bolts or by other secure means. So first off, the lower half of the fifth wheel is everything you see right here on this tractor. The upper half of the fifth wheel is what's on the trailer, the pin, the plate, the part that's welded in. So we do legally have to inspect this to make sure that it is securely attached. So we look at welds, we look at the hook bolts, make sure nothing's loose. If it has grade 8 bolts, hard washers, make sure that they're not loose. Look for rust stains or streaks. If the plate is off of the frame, try to pry it, see if you get any movement whatsoever. If it has U-bolts, they have to be tight. You shouldn't be able to move or wiggle them. It may need to be retorqued if it is loose. Huck bolts, if they're loose, they have to be replaced either with a new huck bolt, cutting the old one off, or replace it with grade 8 fasteners, bolts, washers, and locking nuts. So we check both sides, look at the inside and the outside for those rust stains. The second item then is reject if the lower half of the fifth wheel is cracked, loose, missing. Right? So if it had a fifth wheel, it was it'd crack up in the top here, or any of the attaching points had a crack, and we want to flip this fifth wheel up through the inspection. Both ends of it, get a light underneath there. You can take a pry bar, get underneath of them bushings, and pry it. No movement there. Remember, missing pieces could be as simple as a cotter pin in a securing pin. On the inside, sometimes I'll have a roll pin or a cotter pin. And then the last thing, you want to make sure that the locking device works. So the easiest way to do that is with a pry bar, keep your fingers out away from the jaws here. You want to apply pressure to the locking mechanism and let the jaws close. Okay? It should fully retract the handle. The jaws should come over, lock into place, and then you should be able to unlock it. So those items there are what you need to do to inspect the fifth wheel. Right? Now this one's been clean, there's no grease on it right now, but to check for cracks in the upper plate, you may have to wipe it down. Be careful of sharp edges and whatnot. And you check for cracks up there. Remember, look underneath and check there just as well as you do on the top. The stuff hides underneath there. Right? So that's it. That's what you need to do to inspect the fifth wheel.
When we check the steering system, it talks about the steering wheel free play, and they give you different dimensions of acceptable free play based on the diameter of the steering wheel. So if you notice what we're doing here, first maybe figure out the diameter of your steering wheel, and then you're going to measure how much rotational play or side-to-side play that steering wheel has before it moves the front tires, before the front tires begin to respond. I often hang my head out the window and figure out how much I can move it. Then you're going to want to measure it with a tape measure or a ruler. It's not a bad idea to maybe put a piece of tape on that outer diameter of the steering wheel, wiggle it back and forth. If it's a 16-inch or less diameter steering wheel, you can see you're allowed up to 2 inches of free play, increasing all the way up to a 22-inch steering wheel, which could have a maximum of 2 3/4 inches of free play. So that's how you would check in the cab the steering wheel free play. For the steering column, this one is a little different than our light-duty vehicles. It states that you'll reject if the front wheels cannot be turned to the full right or left position without binding or interference. So you turn that all the way, what we call lock to lock, fully left, fully right, make sure it goes to the steering stops, doesn't bind. What is different here is that it is not saying that it needs to be an equal number of turns left and right. This might vary on a heavy truck. That is not part of the rejection criteria for these vehicles. The steering column, if it's an energy absorbing column, it should not be defective, meaning it shouldn't be collapsed and slide up and down if it's not meant to do so. The U-bolts that attach it under the dash or positioning parts cannot be absent or loose. It does go on to say that some steering columns are designed to permit some movement, possibly float up and down. If that's how it's designed, that would be acceptable. The horn. Now, this is the same wording. It says the vehicle cannot be equipped with a siren, bell, whistle, or a device emitting a harsh or unreasonably loud sound, except on emergency vehicles and vehicles equipped with anti-theft. Now, I do want to point out there are some horns, sometimes they're called train horns, that would be illegal even on heavy trucks. They're too loud, they're excessively loud. However, how do heavy trucks have air horns? Legal air horns that might cause a passenger car or pickup truck to fail. Well, if you think about the location, the horn on a heavy truck, I mean, they do need them because they have greater stopping distance, but just the location, it's on top of the cab. That's going to be mounted pretty high in the air. We're talking 8 foot high, maybe a little higher. That's not the same as what it would look like on a pickup truck. Some horns are mounted not on top of the cab. They might be mounted down underneath, but in that case, they're usually pointing down towards the ground or, so next to the vehicle, it's not going to be excessively loud. Now, if that air horn would be installed in some, I'll call it stupid location that is pointing straight out the side, or if it's an excessively loud horn, yes, it absolutely should fail. This inspection manual does not go by a decibel reading. It kind of points it back to your judgment as a technician. Air brake indicators, this is an important one. It talks about low vacuum indicator. We don't see that often, but that could be on a truck that might have some type of vacuum booster. It'd be required to have a low vacuum indicator that has to activate by the time it reaches 8 inches of mercury or lower. Make sure you're aware of that spec. We don't see it often, but it's a test question that can pop up. And it also goes on to say that if any brake warning system is not working, now I added in there the word properly, but it could be assumed that the brake warning systems need to be working properly. From in the cab, we have a few reject if criteria regarding the air brake or air pressure system. It tells you, and by the way, I want to put out there that this does not match the same air brake criteria set forth by DOT or for CDL training. This is kind of unique, some of these specs to PA safety inspection. So make sure you're familiar with this for the test and just know that it's different than what you might be checking for a CDL type test. So the first one listed here says with the engine stopped and brakes not applied. So you're going to release the parking brake, push in the valve in the dash. Make sure you have the wheels chocked so it's not going to roll away. And you're going to make sure that gauge does not lose more than 3 psi per minute. Now, the wording in the manual says 3 pounds. Really, it should say 3 psi per minute. So you watch the gauge for 1 minute time. Make sure it doesn't drop more than 3 psi. Then they say that you should have the engine running. You're going to make sure the gauge indicates a loss of no more than 4 psi per minute after full brake application for 2 minutes. So with that, you're going to have to let it run until it reaches governor cutout. Otherwise, it's going to build air instead of losing air. And then apply the brakes fully. Full brake application from the pedal. Parking brake is still released. And the 2 minutes is saying that you might have to wait up to 2 minutes for the pressure to stabilize. If you think about doing this on a combination vehicle with a trailer hooked up, it may take a little bit of time for that pressure to stabilize. In most cases, it's not going to take 2 minutes. So as soon as that pressure stabilizes, now you can start your timer. Now you watch the gauge and make sure you don't lose more than 4 psi per minute. Next one says engine running at fast idle. Time to raise the pressure to cutout exceeds 5 minutes. Doesn't really say what pressure we're starting at. Right after this, I do have a video I'll show you, and I'll give you my tips there, what pressure I start at, but that's the wording. Has to build up air to cut out in at least 5 minutes, no longer. And a warning device, audible or visible, does not operate at all pressures at and below 60 psi. A lot of modern trucks, that warning buzzer and light will come on at 75 psi. That's totally fine, but basically this is saying by the time it hits 60, that buzzer or light needs to be operational. So here is a video showing a demonstration of that. one of the first items it says is any brake warning system is not working. We will be checking that during this process, but just to show you real quick, when we turn on the light, you'll hear a buzzer. That's our low air buzzer. And you also saw a lamp there. It went out because our air pressure is not low right now, but that is the low air pressure warning light. On this vehicle, it looks like a circle with 3 arrows pointing inwards, indicating pressure. So one of the first checks the inspection procedure list for air brakes says, with the engine stopped and brakes not applied, the gauge indicates a loss of 3 pounds per minute. Now you'll notice on this truck we have 2 air pressure gauges. The top one here has the letter P, that's our primary, and below it we have a secondary air pressure gauge. They should be very close to the same, but we have 2 systems, and because of that we have 2 gauges. On some vehicles, you will see a single gauge used, but they will use 2 needles, 2 different color needles. On this one, the orange needle is the secondary, and the white needle is the primary, if you have this type of gauge with 2 needles. To do this test, it said with the engine stopped, not running, so that's taken care of, and brakes not applied. That means not pressing on the service brakes, but it also means the parking brakes must be released. So make sure that the wheels are chocked, which we did prior to starting this video, and we're going to release our parking brakes. Give the parking brakes a moment to stabilize pressure, and then you're going to watch that gauge for that specified 1 minute. Now, it's a good idea to maybe snap a picture of it with a phone so you have something to compare with. We're not going to do that for this case, but I will start our timer now, taking note of where both needles are. This gauge is in 25 psi increments, so it's a little hard to recognize small air losses, but we're allowed to lose up to 3 psi per minute. So we're going to let this go for a full minute and see if our gauge moved. I would say on this gauge, 3 psi would be basically the width of a needle. All right. So a minute has now went by. I would say our top gauge has not moved at all. Our gauge for our lower gauge for the secondary has moved the slightest bit, maybe 1 or 2 psi, but would seem to be within that limits. So we'll move on to our next test. And that is, with the engine running, the gauge indicates a loss of more than 4 pounds per minute after full brake application for 2 minutes. Now, as you know, when that engine's running, it is going to build air. So what it's talking about is we will need to start the truck and run it to governor cutout. Governor cutout we will recognize by a few things. We'll see the needle basically peak, reach its highest point and stop. We will also often hear the air dryer exhaust, a clue that we reached governor cutout. So what we're going to do, I'm going to explain it now before the truck is running. We're going to start this truck up, reach governor cutout. My parking brake is still released. I'm then going to apply the service brakes. Now it mentions 2 minutes. What that is saying is allow 2 minutes or up to 2 minutes for these pressures to stabilize. If I have a trailer hooked up on here, it's going to take a little longer. We don't have to wait a full 2 minutes. We're just going to wait until we see these gauges stabilize, start our timer at that point, and we want to make sure we're not losing more than 4 psi per minute. So let's proceed with that test. Alright, so we just reached governor cutout. We're going to apply our brakes, full brake application, and we'll start our timer here in a moment. We want to make sure that stabilizes and start our timer. Alright, so my foot is still on the brakes. I didn't move it. I've kept it pressed to the floor. Our 1 minute's up. We definitely had a significant air loss there. It looked like our secondary gauge started at about 115 psi, and at the end of 1 minute, we were about at 105. The primary looks like it was at 110 and maybe ended at 105. So with the secondary gauge alone, we are definitely exceeded that 4 psi per minute limit, and this would fail. It would be important then to figure out the source of this air leak. I do already hear an air leak coming from the dash, but you can get a helper or apply a brake pedal depressor and look around the truck and find out where the other air leaks are to be able to determine the proper fix. We will proceed with our inspection procedure. At this point, we can now apply our service brake again by pulling out the dash valve. And the next step, we're actually going to skip ahead to D. We're going to skip over C and come back to that. D says a warning device, audible or visible, does not operate at all pressures at and below 60 psi. So you want to make sure that both air brake warning devices, the buzzer and the warning light, come on by the time you reach 60 psi or lower. The best way to drain that air pressure is going to be to pump the brake pedal and to see what pressure those warning devices come on. Obviously, the key has to be on. Now, on some trucks, that buzzer will continue to go constantly when there's no oil pressure. So in that case, it may be necessary to have the truck running when you do this test. But in this case, that buzzer is not running right now, so we can check and see if it pops on by the time we reach 60. So we're going to pump the brake pedal, watching the gauges as we go. A lot of modern trucks will turn on by the time it reaches 75 or 70 psi. That's fine. It just has to be on by the time we hit 60. And there you can see it just turned on. We have our light, we hear our buzzer. This gauge here looks like it's at about at 60 or maybe 65. The other gauge is up closer to 70, but it came on, so our buzzer and our indicator are working. That portion of the test would pass. Now, going back to item C, that regulation states that while the engine with the engine running at fast idle, the time to raise pressure to cutout exceeds 5 minutes. Now, it's a little vague. This doesn't tell us what pressure we're starting at. Doesn't say if we're starting with the air tanks fully drained. Doesn't say if we're starting at 60 psi or if we're starting actually at governor cut-in. So what I typically do, we'll start at 60 psi, basically the same place I want to be to check the buzzer. We'll start it up. Now notice it says at fast idle. So we're not talking about idle. We're talking about, it could even be governor RPM or probably 3/4 throttle. You want to give the truck a decent amount of throttle. Make sure it builds up to governor cutout within 5 minutes. If it's close to that or excessive, there is a problem. You could have a poorly functioning compressor. You could have a blocked air filter or air intake to the compressor. But you'd want to find out what's going on there. So let's get ready to start our timer. And we'll then start the truck to perform this test. Alright, so there we reached governor cutout at basically 4 minutes, 5 seconds, 7 seconds till I hit the timer. This is within specs, but it did take a relatively long time to build up air. So this would pass, but there could certainly be these air leaks causing part of the problem with buildup. You want to make sure it doesn't exceed 5 minutes, otherwise that is a concern. So that completes the internal inspection portion for air brakes. If you recall, this truck did fail for excessive air leaks when the service brake was applied, and so that would be a fail, but it did pass. The warning devices, that portion passed, and the air buildup just was marginal, but it did make it. So hopefully this is going to help in performing the PA safety inspection. For our medium and heavy trucks, there is a rejection criteria for an inside mirror. Little strange wording here. It says reject if mirror is missing unless the vehicle is equipped with outside mirror, except on school buses. So all of these vehicles have to be equipped with an outside mirror. So what that's actually saying is the only vehicle that's required to have the inside mirror is a school bus. If that's not there on a school bus, it would be rejected. Air pressure relief valve. If you look at this slide, I included a few pictures of what that may look like. A few different styles. You want to make sure that the wording says that the air pressure relief valve needs to operate. It's rejected if it does not operate. Problem is, some of those do have rings on them that you could pull, make sure air blows out of there, but truly that doesn't prove that it operates at any given pressure. Some of these others are a button style, and they're designed to operate or open at pressures above 145 or 150 psi, depending on the truck. Can't really test that. We're not going to air up the air system over pressure just to see if this relief valve works. My recommendation is to look for it, make sure it's installed on the system. You might have more than one. That top left picture is showing it on the air dryer down under the truck along a frame rail. Right below it, you can see that valve installed on the side of a compressor. It could also be on the wet tank, or you might have multiple on there. So make sure that somewhere you can see a air pressure relief valve installed on the truck, and that seems to be in good working condition. The air compressor, reject if it's a belt-driven compressor, if the belts are worn, loose, frayed, as to prevent proper operation of the compressor. Now, most heavy truck compressors are gear-driven, so that would not apply on those. There, you're going to make sure the air compressor doesn't have loose mounting bolts, doesn't have a cracked, broken, or loose pulley. On the air compressor, you also want to check the air intake cleaner. It says reject if the air intake cleaner is clogged, as to prevent proper air intake. Now, many air compressors draw directly from the intake manifold or maybe the engine air filter housing. In that case, that's a rather large filter, and if it was blocked up, they would notice engine performance loss long before they'd notice anything with the brakes. The ones you really have to look out for are the ones shown in this picture, where they have their own little air filter on the side of the compressor. Those small air filters are obviously small in capacity, and they're notorious for being neglected, that no one's checking them, no one's cleaning them, they get ignored, and they get so caked up with dirt and mud that there will be a loss of pumping in the air compressor. This would also probably affect the buildup time that you want reach governor cutout in a quick, timely manner. But make sure if this has a separate air filter that you're checking it and make sure it's not clogged. On the air brake system, it says reject if the brake hoses seep or swell under application of pressure. They shouldn't balloon up. There shouldn't be air seeping through them. It also says that it's rejectable if the connecting hoses are made improperly joined. So if a splice is made by putting hose ends over a pipe or tubing and hose clamps on there, that's rejectable. Now, with our air brake system, it is acceptable for us to use compression fittings on our brake lines, our tubing. That is a little different than hydraulic brakes that operate at much higher pressure than air brakes. On hydraulic brakes, compression fittings are unacceptable, but on air brakes that operate at basically a maximum of 130 psi on some trucks, it is acceptable to use compression fittings. On the tires, a lot of the same criteria as our light-duty vehicles, but there is a difference when it comes to the steer axle. So minimum tread depth is still 2/32 for most wheel ends, except for the steer axle. And actually, the wording in the inspection manual specifically calls out the front tires, which typically would be the steer, but the wording is the front axle. You have to have 4/32, a minimum of 4/32 tread on those vehicles for anything over a gross vehicle weight rating of 10,000 pounds. So that would include all of our, actually includes a few light duty vehicles, because if you remember, they go up to 11,000 pounds, and it includes all of our medium and heavy duty vehicles. You're going to check the diameter of duals. They need to be within 3/8 inches of each other. Otherwise, one tire is carrying an unequal amount of load compared to the other. You really want to check for this if you have different tread depths on them. If you have a new tire next to a worn out tire, and it could easily be difference of more than 3/8 inch diameter, which is rejectable. You also want to reject the vehicle if the tire's tread extends beyond the outer edge of the wheel housing, inclusive of fender flares, or exceeds the manufacturer's specs as to size. Some vehicles, I think of the front load cement mixers, some of those front tires, even from the factory, will stick out a little beyond the body. That, if that's how it's designed, that's acceptable, if that's the manufacturer's specs. But if it's changed, it should not go beyond the outer edge of the wheel housing or fender flares. It says reject if the wheelbase on one side differs from the wheelbase on the other side by more than 1 inch. Again, this is the same wording in our light duty vehicles. It does not specify, though, when we have a tandem truck or multiple axles, which axles we're measuring to. At the very least, I would say you should be measuring from the forwardmost to the rearmost axle. In practicality, it's probably best to check every axle for this. Make sure it's not off by more than 1 inch, because that will throw off the thrust line and will greatly affect tire wear. Studded tires, same dates as light duty. They cannot be in use after April 15th. or before November 1st. Any axle has missing wheels or rims. Now that obviously could apply to duals, that you would only have one wheel installed and it's meant to have duals. It could also be a lift axle. The lift axle on there might not be touching the ground, but it needs to have wheels and rims on there. And it's also rejectable if a tire is smaller than the manufacturer's recommended minimum size or less than the recommended load rating. So make sure we're checking the tires that they're sufficient load rating for the vehicle they are on. On the steering system, it has you check the movement at front or rear of tire, and the spec will vary based on your rim diameter. So in this picture, I know that technician is doing an alignment, but the way he's grasping the tire, essentially at the 3 and 9 o'clock position, that's what you're going to do. And you're going to try and wiggle that back and forth like you're steering, but you want to make sure that's not moving the steering shaft or the steering wheel. We're basically catching any free play in the linkage, the gearbox, and whatever that adds up to be at the wheel. So if our rims are 16 inches or under, you're allowed a 1/4 inch. If you have a 17 or 18 inch rim, you're allowed 3/8 inch of movement, and this is measured at the edge of the tire. And if you have a over 18 inch rim, which is most of the heavy trucks, you're allowed up to a 1/2 inch, which is quite a bit. Now they do go on to say there that make sure any looseness detected is not wheel bearing free play. If that is the case, you can eliminate wheel bearing free play by applying the service brakes. But in my experience, most trucks are far less than that 1/2 inch spec or whatever the permissible amount would be. And if that's the case, you don't have to eliminate wheel bearing free play. Eliminating wheel bearing free play would only make it smaller. So if I measure that and it's a 1/2 inch or a little more, yes, I'll eliminate wheel bearing free play to make sure it's not the wheel bearings and it is the steering linkage. But if I check it and it's, allowed to be a 1/2 inch and I only have a 1/8 inch, then it's already passes. I don't need to eliminate the wheel bearing free play. Reject if the universal joint, this is referring to the steering system universal joint on the steering shaft. You might have one or more than one U-joint in there. Make sure it's not faulty, shows repairs that were welded or that it's, cracked or mangled. Underneath the vehicle, it says check the front axle beam and steering components. Make sure they're not cracked. Show repairs that were obviously welded. So it is unsafe to repair any steering components. They shouldn't be welded. A JB weld would be even worse. If there's anything you can see like that, it is rejectable. When steering components are damaged, they need to be replaced, and that includes the front axle beam. Kingpin movement can be checked. You'll have to have the vehicle jacked up, wheels off the ground. And if you have a 20-inch rim or less, you're allowed a 1/4 inch. If it's over 20-inch rims, you're allowed a 1/2 inch of kingpin movements. This could be measured with a tape measure or with a ball joint stand gauge like you see in this picture here. And we have a video up next showing how to do that.
Most kingpin manufacturers recommend using a dial indicator to inspect the kingpins. However, for safety inspection, Pennsylvania gives a different specification and does not reference manufacturer specs. Pennsylvania states that for kingpins on rims less than 20 inches, you're allowed a 1/4 inch of movement, and on rims 20 inches and larger, you're allowed a 1/2 inch of movement. So as you can see here, we have a 22.5 inch rim that we're going to demonstrate measuring the kingpins on. You want to begin by jacking up the truck and positioning the tire just a few inches above the ground like we have here. Then, one of my recommendations is to center one of the openings of the wheel at the upper position, the one without the valve stem, which will allow you to rock the wheel back and forth easily. We're going to take a pedal depressor, go in the cab, and apply the brake pedal. Now, by applying the brake pedal, we have a dual benefit of eliminating the wheel bearing movement at the wheel end, but also it's going to keep the wheel from rotating while we try to obtain our measurement. We're going to be using this kingpin gauge, or it's an old style ball joint gauge. As you can see on the gauge here, it reads in thousandths of an inch or 10,000ths increments, each line being 100th or 10,000ths of an inch. I'm going to take this, position it on the ground, and push it in against the bead of the tire. Notice I'm not going on the rim because it's a thin edge, it could slip off, but I'm positioning it right below there on the bead, and I'm pushing it in until the pointer's in the middle of the gauge at the 0 point. Then going to take a bar, position it in my wheel assembly, and then rock my tire up and down. Apply upward pressure and downward pressure, and you can see on this wheel we're getting about 30 thousandths of movement. This is well within specifications. For this tire, Pennsylvania regulations would allow a ½ inch of movement, which if you look at the gauge, that would be needle travel from this point to this point. Considerably more travel. That is how you inspect kingpins as per the Pennsylvania regulations.
Suspension, it says reject if a part of a torque, radius, or tracking component assembly or part used for attaching the same to the vehicle frame or axle is cracked, loose, broken, or missing. So those are the 4 things that fail: cracked, loose, broken, or missing. Here you can see a transverse torque rod attached to the frame rail, and you want to make sure that's not loose, there's no hardware missing, nothing's cracked. And notice it says this does not apply to loose bushings and torque or track rods. Those rubber bushings can get hammered out, a little sloppy. That's okay as long as it limits movement at some point. It just can't be cracked or torn free. On the air suspension, this is the only criteria we see. It says it's rejectable if the air suspension is leaking. So air's coming out of it, or if it's deflated, it doesn't air up at all, that would be a fail. On the frame, it mentions an adjustable axle assembly. Now, this is not something we typically see on most trucks, but maybe once in a while you'll see it, and that's why it's in this chapter. This is something that is more seen on trailers, which they are a different subchapter anyway. But what it's saying is basically if you have an adjustable axle assembly, it needs to lock in. It has to engage. It doesn't have to release and be adjustable, but it's got to have the pins in and be properly engaged. The exhaust system wording can be a little confusing. So I want to point out that this part on page 59, this section we're looking at here, is talking about gasoline-powered buses, and that includes school buses. What it says is that the exhaust system of a bus powered by a gasoline engine shall discharge to the atmosphere at or within 6 inches forward of the rearmost part of the bus. So this is not saying the exhaust can stop under the vehicle. They're saying it can come out anywhere along the back edge at the back bumper or 6 inches around the corner on either the left or right. So you have a small portion back there that it just could come out the side, but it's got to be within 6 inches in the back of the vehicle. For diesel-powered buses, they word it as fuels other than gasoline, so that could include some others, CNG, such also. The exhaust can discharge either at or within 15 inches forward of the rearmost part of the vehicle. So now we have a 15-inch corner to work with, or it says to the rear of all doors or windows designed to be open, except windows designed to be open solely as emergency exits. So, let's say the windows stop 3 feet short of that last, at the corner of the bus, which actually, if you look in the background of that picture, you see a bus similar to that. It could come out anywhere in that range. It wouldn't be held to the exact 15 inches mentioned earlier. They did put out a bulletin, BI 07-3, to talk about exhaust tips, the diffusing tips that came out when we saw more DPFs and regen systems. They can be shaped like a shoehorn in the one in the top picture, or have venturi holes like the lower picture. And some questions arose when we say it has to go to the outside edge of the vehicle. Are these still going to the outside edge? So these 2 pictures are directly from their bulletin. And basically they're saying, yes, these are normal. They do pass inspection. That shoehorn one is still going to the outside edge. The one with the venturi holes actually just draws air in. No exhaust comes out those holes, and that would be acceptable. Now, that tip needs to be on there. Can't be that tip's cut off or has fallen off. That would not be considered going to the outside edge if it was missing. Brake system inspection. Wording's a little different, again, than our light-duty vehicles. Here it says to remove at least one front and one opposite rear wheel. However, it throws in there that it's not necessary to remove the wheel and drum assembly if there is a removable backing plate that allows examination of the brake system, which a lot of our air brake, drum brake systems, foundation brake, if S-cam brakes, if you like, will have removable backing plates. So if that's the case, you do not have to pull the wheels. Yes, you do need to remove those backing plates, the shields, to be able to get in there to inspect them and check for proper lining, check drum condition, do an inspection of that. I do want to throw in there that air disc brakes are out there, and it said if I have drum brakes with the removable backing plates. I posed this question to PennDOT, and air brakes do not fall under that. They do not have removable backing plates. You're really limited what can be inspected when the wheel's installed. So if it has air disc brakes, yes, you must remove the tires, the wheels, on one front and one opposing rear wheel location. On the air brakes, reject if there's air leaks in the air brake system valves, diaphragms, or piston cups. So you don't want any air leaks. Make sure you're checking brake chambers. Make sure it's not coming out the hole, that the diaphragm in there is torn or leaking. Brake drums, you're going to measure them just like you would light duty, but notice that the scores are allowed to be significantly more. Or these drums are allowed to be scored up to 60 thousandths, can't be deeper than that. Drum diameter, again, it can't be larger than, they say 90 thousandths over original for a 14-inch or less drum, or drums 14 inch or larger, it can't be more than 120 thousandths over original spec. So a lot of our S-cam brakes use 16.5-inch drums. That means the discard size would be 16.620. Brake lining, similar specs for bonded. 2/32 is the minimum at thinnest point. Riveted, 1/32 at thinnest point, measured on top of the rivet head. Make sure you dig the dirt and dust, the brake dust, out of the rivet holes to measure that. And there is a new type of lining here. I don't want to say it's new technology-wise, just new, first to be mentioned in the inspection manual here, and that's bolted lining. Some of the heavy-duty truck applications would have used this. I don't know that it's as common today, but bolted lining is measured at the center of the shoe, and that can't be less than 5/16 inch in thickness at the center. Service brakes, on page 59, it's got two weird statements, one after the other, that, in my opinion, needs to be updated or combined. So that's what I did here. And basically, it says a truck or truck tractor with 3 or more axles manufactured after, so that was the original date they mentioned, but really July 24th, 1980 is not equipped with service brakes on all axles. It said that basically that first date they had until a later date to have that included, but that came and went a long time ago. So really, it's anything manufactured after that date in 1980 has to have service brakes on all axles. For our steering axle brake components, it says reject if one or more of the following are mismatched across the motor vehicle steering axle. Now, this is a good practice to have them matched on every axle, but notice it's only rejectable on a steering axle. It says the air chamber size, so we're talking about the diameter or the type. If you have a type 24 chamber or type 30, they need to be the same across the axle. The slack adjuster length, and even what hole it's pinned in, they should basically have the same length or leverage. That's important. And retracted push rod length should not differ by more than 1/2 inch. Now that's going to be retracted when the brakes are released. Measure it. It should be within 1/2 inch to give equal geometry to the brakes and give you equal braking so that the vehicle does not pull when the brakes are applied. On page 60, it talks about the body mounts. They do add an extra word in here. They say to inspect critical body mounts. Now, the other, for light duty, we just saw body mounts. Here, what is a critical body mount? Well, I agree that certainly anything holding the cab on is a critical body mount. Something that's holding just a fender and it's nothing more than that might not be a critical body mount. Again, you're going to have to make the judgment call what's critical or not. But for the critical ones, the body mounts have to hold as required, and they cannot be broken, cracked, deteriorated, or missing. These vehicles do require a road test. We mentioned that kind of in the beginning. You're going to need if it's over 26,000 pounds, you're going to need a CDL to take it out to a road test. During the road test, the odometer needs to work unless it's at least 25 years old or over 17,000 GVW. So our heavy trucks do not have to have a working odometer for PA safety inspection. The speedometer still has to work, but some trucks, for example, might only be equipped with an hour meter and not an odometer. That's acceptable. The odometer has to work only on vehicles that are under 17,000 and less than 25 years old. Now, one thing I like to point out when I teach this is we didn't really see anything with brake adjustment, with our free stroke or applied stroke of our slack adjusters. And if you have a CDL, you know that's a critical part. They teach that as part of the pre-trip inspection. So why is it not rejectable? Well, think about it. If it's taught as part of the pre-trip, it's the responsibility of the driver to check that. Now, I'm aware that most trucks are equipped with automatic slack adjusters these days, but you still want to check them to make sure they're within stroke. If that automatic slack adjuster failed, and they do fail at times, they could be out of stroke and that brake might not be applying or applying with checked proper strength. So this should be done as part of a pre-trip. And I will also add, if you're the inspecting mechanic taking this truck out on the highway, you should be doing a pre-trip before you drive it. So I don't know that this is as much of a rejectable criteria as something they'd want you to adjust or address. It not necessarily just fail for inspection, but doesn't mean we ignore it. It's just not, it doesn't fall into the rejectable criteria. And with that, while we're on the topic of automatic slack adjusters, there is a bulletin BI 07-3, and that points out that you don't want to just manually adjust an automatic slack adjuster. That can cause problems because one, it's hiding a problem that the automatic slack adjuster is not adjusting like it should. And furthermore, some drivers like to have them just a little tighter than they maintained, even though they were in spec. That frequent adjustment will wear out the internal mechanism in there and cause that slack adjuster to fail or stop adjusting prematurely. So for automatic slack adjusters, which have been on vehicles since 94, or required on vehicles since 94, you want to make sure they're in stroke, in the applied stroke range for the size of the brake chamber or type of brake chamber. But if they aren't, you don't adjust them any further than that. As long as it's acceptable in specs, you leave it where it is. If it's outside of those specs, then you want to look into why it's not adjusting properly. Is it a setup problem or is it a failed automatic slack adjuster? It's not part of this chapter, but obviously we mentioned that this license will allow you to inspect trailers over 10,000 pounds. Trailers are found in Subchapter G. And I always like to point out on page 67, the road test portion. Trailers require a road test. Any trailer getting a PA safety inspection sticker, and no matter what the GVW, requires a road test. And here it says, perform a road test of a trailer over 3,000 pounds, registered gross weight, and reject if the vehicle is not capable of stopping within the maximum stopping distance described in Table 1 in the back of the book, or swerves so that any part leaves the 12-foot lane. That's really the only thing we're road testing on trailers. And by the way, trailers under 3,000 GVW do not require PA safety inspection. So as a review, I'm hoping you can go through and answer these questions. I don't really want to answer them for you because that takes away some of the value. Feel free to pause the video and see how many of these you can answer and go back into the training as needed. This concludes the training. I hope you found this useful, and I wish you well in your efforts to inspect Category 3 vehicles as part of the Pennsylvania Safety Inspection Program.